Realistic Batman is kind of boring. There's only so many stories you can tell with a realistic version of Batman. It's why we happen to see so many of the same characters being reused when it comes to Batman films. Think about the kind of villains that we tend to see in more recent adaptations of Batman. They tend to be the more grounded and down-to-earth villains. We don't really see villains like Clayface. We don't tend to see villains like Killer Croc. We don't tend to see villains like Poison Ivy, and when we do see villains such as Ra's al Ghul, they tend to be warped and twisted in a way that makes them far more realistic. Man-Bat is almost never shown despite being one of my personal favorite rogues, and Mr. Freeze...
Stay cool, bird boy.
Well, we don't talk about that adaptation. Instead, we tend to get the same revolving door of characters like Joker, Two-Face, Riddler, street-level criminals like Carmine Falcone, all jump to mind as like what we get with realistic Batman films. We don't even get characters like Harley Quinn too often in the live-action versions, simply because she's a little bit more off the wall. Even though Joker tends to be heavily prevalent, she's not always there. Something I will always give the Snyderverse credit for was the fact that they were willing to add more of the superheroisms of a comic book world when it came to things like Doomsday, Harley Quinn, Killer Croc, all of these characters that just don't tend to fit the realistic sense of Batman films, especially ones popularized during the 2000s. We're kind of being forced to rehash the same sorts of plots all the time when it comes to realistic versions of Batman, because there's only so many stories you can tell. You can't have a plot of Mr. Freeze putting his wife on ice and then trying to ice out the entirety of Gotham just to get enough money to save her, because it's just a little bit too out there, and not something that's very comfortable for Warner Brothers, let's be honest, to try and do with the character of Batman, because they see that realistic Batman is profitable and realistic Batman works. And it all started, obviously, with Christopher Nolan's Batman in the early 2000s. I can see why we got a hyper-real version of Batman during that time, because if you think back to 2005 when that movie came out, we're fresh off the heels of X-Men in the 2000s, which took a way more action thriller look over comic book look, and that movie was wildly popular. Was it accurate to the characters? No, but it was wildly popular. And so they took that more realistic approach, and it started to be applied like a fresh coat of paint to a lot of different superhero mediums. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man is actually one of the few examples that escaped that less comic booky look and feel. Batman was no different. Christian Bale's Batman comes onto the scene, he's realistic, he's gritty. It's drama-filled movies that are full of super serious characters doing super serious things. And oddly enough, that tends to fit Batman pretty well. We're talking about a character with no superpowers that's super rich that could theoretically exist in our world. So it makes sense to try and make Batman realistic. And what we got was a trilogy of movies that tried their hardest to continue along the lines of as real as possible, but in the process had to make a lot of concessions. Look at the way Batman fights throughout the trilogy. Something that's been memed on a lot as of recent years is how the choreography is just kind of a little weird, and Batman looks like he is struggling to box three dudes. Realistic, yes. But is it fun? Is it necessarily cool? I don't really think so. And then we have to look at things like Ra's al Ghul. There is no Lazarus pit, it's just convenient trickery. We look at things such as Bane. There is no Venom. He's just a really strong dude on constant pain meds. And that just sounds like Kurt Angle. And then after Bale's trilogy, we didn't have a true solo Batman film until the Batman 2022. Now, I'm kind of glazing over Zack Snyder's Batman because he didn't get a movie to himself, and throughout a majority of it, despite being overly serious, overly gritty, and overly dark in tone, even for the characters, Superman, who shouldn't have been so dark in tone, they did a pretty good job at making Batman feel extraordinary, like the peak of human physiology And I just think back to the fight scene in Dawn of Justice, where Batman was actively flying around the room, looking more akin to Arkham Batman than Christian Bale's Batman ever did. But with what is going to be the newest trilogy of Batman movies with Robert Pattinson, we've circled back once again to dark, gritty, and realistic. I mean, looking at his first movie, while great, just omits a ton of fun Batman things. For example, there is no name or theming. Sure, we call it the Batmobile, but that's not what it's called in the film. The Batsuit isn't called the Batsuit, there are no official Batarangs. There is no fun and interesting looking tech. It is mostly what you could theoretically build in a real world. And as well, Batman himself isn't fully Batman. I love the suit, but the fact that he can't glide at all was really a point that kind of bothered me. He had to use a wingsuit. It didn't feel very Batman. It felt like something else. Now again, this is just me nitpicking, and I want to make it very, very clear. I grew up watching a lot of these things. I grew up consuming as much Batman media as possible. At one point in my life, he was my favorite character, and Nolan's Batman films were my favorite movies. I love the Batman 2022, and while I have a video on it that nobody watched, I really did enjoy that film. But ultimately for me, it just feels too realistic and it feels too repetitive. I want to see characters that are out there and off the wall. I want a somewhat return to less serious Batman with more zany adventures. Something we're often robbed of on screen is Batman and Superman's wonderful relationship. Something to me that is just such a core to Batman's character. And even throwing in Wonder Woman, Super Friends, those three relationships in the comic books is so integral to Bruce as a character, and we don't see any of that in any of his films or movies. And I get it, those are other superheroes that are big names and maybe it's hard to get them in films, so it's easier to tune down the scope and be more realistic. But this realism is also the reason we don't tend to see characters like Robin, we don't get Nightwing, we won't get Red Hood and Jason, and all of these great stories that Batman has. And speaking of great stories, The Court of Owls is probably one of the greatest Batman stories in recent history that's been written, and the odds that we would have seen it under a hyper-realistic Batman is extremely low, and that's something that's really sad, because The Court of Owls is an absolutely phenomenal story about greed and corruption that takes place at the heart of Gotham, all ruled by the wealthy socialite class who are using literal zombie assassins to go around the city and murder people. It's one of the best Batman stories ever and pushes Batman to his absolute limits, but we'll probably never see that in a realistic Batman film. It's not something that tends to fit the tone of realism, you know, despite the oligarchs that rule the world with lots of money part. No, more like the zombie assassins thing. It doesn't really fit the consciousness of the real world. It's probably why we haven't seen a story like that. That and the story's fairly new, as it came out with the New 52, one of the only things good to come from the New 52. It's actually why I'm so excited for James Gunn's version of Batman. We saw that with James Gunn's Superman, he was completely unafraid to bring a campy, more fun, and less serious version of Superman to screen. I think he'll bring a great balance between keeping Batman serious, keeping him gritty, and keeping him a detective, while also giving us the aspects of the character that we've been denied for so many years. The things like Bat Family, Batman having a larger family outside of just Alfred. Things like him having Ace the dog, for example, which is not something we've seen included in any of the Batman films, especially the ones that fixate on hyper-realism. Another aspect of the character that we don't tend to see because it is a little bit too far-fetched and out there in these typically movie interpretations of Batman is like the Tibetan monks. And I know everybody likes to meme on that right now, talking about some Batman got superpowers from those Tibetan monks. Let him go toe-to-toe with Darkseid and Batman the Brave and the Bold. I'm not talking about going that crazy and going that out there, but I'm saying we're cutting out pieces and portions of his mythos to make him more palatable for realism. And it's kind of boring. It takes the mythos away from the Bat. And unfortunately, it's all we've been spoon-fed for, God, like the last 20 years of Batman content when it comes to live action versions. And so I feel like I've spent a lot of time bringing up like the issues with realistic Batman and why I think it's boring, and I think part of that might be a little bit of oversaturation. It's really all we've got for Batman in the last 20 years outside of video games and comic books and some animated projects. Batman himself has been confined to being realistic for so long that I want to see him step out of those confines. And I know the last time that he did that, we ended up with Joel Schumacher's Batman movies, and well, we all know how those ended. Even though I might have some love for them in my heart, they weren't really good movies, and they were a little bit too zany and off the wall. I would rather look at a case study that everybody loves. Batman the Animated Series. It sits right in front of our faces and stares right back at us. We're talking about a show that wasn't overly dark, it wasn't overly gritty, and yet conveyed the idea that Gotham is a dangerous place, Gotham is a deadly place. The villains are not just there to be evil for evil's sake, but rather tend to be truly mentally ill people in need of help that Batman is trying to provide to them. It is not hyper-realistic. We see characters like Poison Ivy, who literally had an entire family grown out of fake plants and even faked herself with a fake plant, all to deceive Batman. We had whole episodes where Harley Quinn and Ivy just went around wrecking stuff and shopping. We had whole episodes dedicated to the Bat family. We got to see the progression of Dick Grayson go from Robin to Nightwing. We got to see the falling out between him and Batman. And when we might have skipped over Jason Todd, we got somewhat of Jason Todd light in Batman the Return of the Joker with Tim Drake. It's kept towards that theming of dark, gritty, almost disgusting and grimy vibe that Gotham has, but gave us a Batman that cracked jokes. It gave us a Batman that cared, a Batman that was emotional, and that wasn't completely shut off from himself and from the world. One of my biggest criticisms of the Batman 2022 is that Bruce feels a little bit too much like a reclusive shut-in. And I get that hopefully, most likely, they're gonna take the next two movies to build out his emotional framework and to build him out as Bruce Wayne, as the philanthropic billionaire with a genuine, gigantic heart. Because that's what Batman has. He has a giant heart, and he wants to give back to his community. I have an entire video talking about how Batman needs compassion. Because if you write a Batman that won't hold a child, you're just writing the Punisher in a funny costume. That line has been thrown around forever for a reason. And that's something that has always bugged me about these realistic versions of Batman, is they don't seem to have any care for that aspect of the character. It's almost as though they only focus on the gritty, dark portions, whereas something like BTAS went out of its way to try and show you that it's okay for your Batman to be compassionate. It's okay for your Batman to occasionally crack jokes. It's okay for your villains to be wacky and zany and wild and all over the place and crazy. I mean, look at that show's Clayface. It is a true Clayface. He is the mass monster of clay, and yet they made him endearing. They gave him a story worth listening and watching. It is phenomenal work, and yet he's still zany and out there and weird. I think if there was any superhero that you would want to try and make realistic, the answer is Batman. It will always be Batman. It's the easiest, it's the most profitable, and it makes the most sense with the least amount of mental gymnastics. But I feel like it makes the character boring after a while. There's only so many times I can see Batman fight Carmine Falcone before I start to wonder where other characters are at. Where's my boy Waylon Jones? I want to see that man on screen. I get bored with the notion that Batman isn't fighting anybody with superpowers. He's just fighting regular everyday people. And another thing that I haven't really spoke on in this video, but I feel like needs to be mentioned, is how this realism also hurts Batman's rogues gallery. Specifically characters like the Joker, in my opinion. The focus on hyper-realism for the Joker tends to genuinely hurt him as a character. And before I get crucified by all of you guys, let me make this very clear. Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker was and is phenomenal. It is amazing. I love it for a lot of reasons, but I love it as an adaptation of the character. And the problem that I've seen is that that adaptation of the character became the base for him. Heath Ledger's Joker doesn't really make jokes. He is, for the most part, sound of mind. He's not crazy, he's not manic. He doesn't do it for the love of the game. For as much as he talks big about not having any plans, that Joker had a plan. The Joker that I like, the one that often I read about and am the most afraid of, is the one with no plan. The one that is manic, the one that is crazy, the one that is in it for the thrill of ruining Batman's day, even in some of the most slight and minute ways. One of my favorite episodes of the animated series ever is an entire episode dedicated to the Joker just showing up to this random guy's work and just ruining his day. He follows the guy home because the guy made the terrible mistake of cutting Joker off in traffic, and just torments some random dude for the entire day. It's something that Joker would do, and it's something we would never see in a realistic Batman film or TV show or series. It robs us of these great little stories, these things that help build the world out. And it's such an interesting concept to have a Joker that isn't nearly as ordinary. I mean, we all kind of see what happened with Jared Leto's Joker when it came to being a little too realistic with the tattoos and all that other fun stuff. I'm not saying that realistic Batman is bad. Actually, to the contrary. I think it really worked in Robert Pattinson's movie. I think it worked in the Christian Bale, Nolan verse. But it's boring. I am bored of realistic Batman. I want some camp. I want Batman to crack a few jokes. I want Batman to be able to express himself. I want his villains to have their full range of personality. I don't want Two-Face to be so level-headed. I want him to be crazily obsessed with his coin. I'm talking Telltale's version of Two-Face, the animated series version of Two-Face, to some extent like Arkham City's version of Two-Face. I'm talking about letting these characters be what they were meant to be and not constraining them by forcing them to be like us. I want a wider world of characters for Batman to interact with. One of my favorite parts of reading a comic book series is when random superheroes just pop up. It's something that James Gunn's Superman did really well. Metamorpho was just in the movie. Mr. Terrific was just there. Guy Gardner was there. All of these Batman movies lack a wider connection to the DC universe where maybe Superman or Wonder Woman could pop in at any time, maybe a Green Lantern or two, and not have a huge significance on the story, but just to come and say hi, to remind us they exist. None of that can happen in a realistic Batman movie because they would not fit in a world like Robert Pattinson's world. That's the number one reason we're never gonna see him with David Cornsweet's Superman, is because Superman could not exist in the same world that Pattinson's Batman exists, because one of them is far too rooted in reality. Just take a moment and think about some of Batman's greatest comic books. Hush, that couldn't be adapted into a hyper-realistic look. The Dark Knight Rises tried its best to adapt Bane in a realistic way, but failed in giving us some of the most fun aspects of Nightfall. All of Batman's villains, supervillains breaking out, him taking care of them in a week flat, and then getting crushed by Bane. We missed out on all of that because it's not too realistic, and well, obviously Heath Ledger and that whole situation, which again, rest in peace to the GOAT. Ultimately, we're robbed of a lot of these cool storylines. Like I've said earlier, the Court of Owls would not happen. And we're never going to see something like Under the Red Hood in its original comic book adaptation because Superboy punches a hole in the entirety of reality. That's Superboy Prime, by the way, for those of you that like to get on my ass. Also, please don't be taking a shot every time I say real or reality or realism. You will go to the hospital, and I am not responsible for that. Anyways, this whole idea that these things have to be real kind of just bugged me, because we'll never get wacky things that are not built upon the constraints of realism. Now, sometimes I do think that realistic Batman makes for these wonderful creative solutions to like the comic book source material, to getting around it. For example, Under the Red Hood, and I know this is an animated film, couldn't do the Superboy Prime punches Earth, so they did Jason in the Lazarus Pit, and I genuinely think that was a better adaptation of the comic book than the comic book itself. But ultimately, we're never going to get some of Batman's best stories, and you think of things like The Dark Knight, for example, The Dark Knight the book and the animated movie by Frank Miller. We're probably never going to see that in live action the way it was brought to the comic book, because it involves Batman versus Superman. And I know Zack Snyder gave us that, but not in the way that most of us would have wanted to see it. Ultimately, we would miss out on a lot of what makes Batman Batman. And if I haven't convinced you by this point in the video, then I've probably done my job very poorly, and you can flame me for that. If you love realistic Batman, that's cool, and that's great. But I want something more. I want Killer Croc. I want not the Kane, like Carslow version of Clayface, but the modern interpretation of the character. I want Mr. Freeze to be brought back and to be taken seriously this time, and not have a bunch of shitty ice puns. I want these characters that aren't the most realistic. I want Poison Ivy to be a main villain of one of the Batman movies. That would be dope. I want the Bat family. I want a lot of these things, and I'm hoping James Gunn's Batman can give us that on the big screen, because they really did come through with Superman. I hope that we're entering a renaissance for comic book movies, one that enables us, the viewer, to see all of these crazy characters come to life in a way that is almost just like the page, in a way that is interesting, in a way that weaves in some reality while also leaving the foundation of the fact that this is a comic book. It is escapism at the end of the day, and it should be an enjoyable watch. That's it. I've taken enough of your time, so thank you all so much for watching. If you liked the video, please leave a like, helps out the channel a lot. If you disliked the video, please comment down below with some constructive criticism so I can continue to be a better creator for all of you. If you want to sub, you can always unsubscribe later. It just helps out the channel. If you want to support me further, I have a Patreon, so for $1 a month, you can see these videos early and completely unedited. It's something I really do take pride in, so if you want to support me, that's cool. And if you're in the $5 or above tier, I shout your name out at the end of each and every one of my videos. So without further ado, shout out Athena, shout out Ethan, shout out Kelly Sloan, Grimir, Davidson, Kane Kent, John, Demetrius Youngblood, Metal Monk, West Belladonna, Oscar, McGann, eSibert 13, Gabriel Lafonte, Video Gamer 75, Golden Boy 420, Dakota Ross and Donovan Gomez, and MC Bomb 27. You all are amazing. Hope you all have an absolutely fantastic day.